rubbish. I know I really should learn to speak Spanish, but unfortunately I haven't. So I'll be speaking in English, I'm afraid. So apologies for that first, but it's really great I wish I was in person. Unfortunately, I'm not, but it's really good to be talking to you all here today, this evening, about something pretty exciting that happened yesterday, actually in Boston, but throughout the entire world. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So hopefully, Joel, people can see the slides.
Yes, yes, we can see your presentation.
Okay, good. Let's go over and start presenting. So as you know, probably, I'm sure that you've heard of this before. I am Scrum.org. Scrum.org, well, I'm not Scrum.org, but I run Scrum.org for Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum. And you know what we do, training, certification. You know, we have some amazing PSTs, of which Joel is one of them. Great body of knowledge, Scrum.org website. Before COVID, we were training between 5,000 and 7,000 people a month. Now, actually, it's almost 5,000 a month again with live virtual classes, which is great. And you know about the certifications. I'm not going to bore you with that. So before I talk about Scrum, I want to talk a little bit about why and provide some context for what's been happening in the world. So if I was talking last year, I kicked off many of my presentations with really a conversation about change and the fact that we live in changing world, right? We live in an environment where, you know, in the US, Sears, one of the largest retailers, is closing continuously, where GE were powerhouse of the industrial age. Ultimately, their share price now it's actually come up recently, less than $5 a share. Amazon's moving into pharmaceuticals, and that means, you know, suddenly all of the retailers like CVS and Walgreens no longer are, their share price dropped when it was announced. And even Facebook, you know, darling of the digital age, is having a seriously hard time as we wrestle with disinformation and the like. But I don't need to talk about that anymore because we have COVID. COVID has illustrated to us, I think, in the most appropriate way, how we are ultimately living in complex times. Our ability to respond on, you know, the environment that we live in is complex. And I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but my 2020 plans, were awesome. And we started executing in January and February. And then in March, I threw them out the window and had to replan on a month-by-month basis as we wrestled with a very changing world around us, which was super interesting. Now, you know, this shouldn't come as a surprise. Thomas Friedman, a New York Times and Washington Post columnist, has written a number of books. Perhaps his most famous book is The World is Flat. Some of you may have read it. It's an awesome book. His latest book, Thank You for Being Late, talks about the fact that we're at the mercy of three very different explosive changes in the world. One is around the world is flat, digital globalization, the fact that we ran out of toilet paper in the US when China could no longer send it to us, which is crazy, eh? We live in this world. Mother Nature, I think if you're in Peru, I think you know the impact of climate change probably better than anybody. You understand population growth. So you look at Brazil around you and others. There's the South America and Central America are perhaps poster children for this. And then, of course, the change of technology. So these three massively changing areas are pushing this supernova of change. Another interesting perspective on this is Kalida Perez, an economist from Venezuela, who writes about these changing ages. And she believes clearly that COVID-19 is a tipping point to the deployment period of the digital age. These are the previous ages. You can read them. And that's super interesting and super exciting because as we sit in our houses as COVID and political uncertainty happens, I mean, we're not immune to it here in the US, as you probably are aware. We're like, oh my God, the world is really bleak. But ultimately, if it follows the pattern of previous ages, then we are about to emerge into a deployment period. And a deployment period, as you can read there, tends to be awesome. The Great British Leap changed the United Kingdom, defined it in its basically its position in the world, as did the Victorian boom. And then, of course, Age of Steel, US, and the next two US ages. And now we'll see what happens in the digital age. So that means ultimately that the world is very different. And the reason why I say this when I talk about the Scrum Guide is because I think that the change around the world and this complex environment is at the heart of the changes we're making to the Scrum Guide and the impact of Scrum on the world around us. These are some of the characteristics of this new age. Predominantly, though, you'll see it's about innovation, it's around teams, it's around self-management and empowered teams. It's about creators delivering value to customers. One of the most interesting impacts of COVID, as defined by a recent McKinsey study, was that the relationship between high-level managers, level ones and twos, which are basically executives, C-levels, senior vice presidents, and the people in the teams doing the work, the 7 and 8 level kind of people, has increased because of COVID. The rise of the creator is a reality in anybody's organization because ultimately the people that are delivering value to customers, building new products, servicing customers, responding to the market, are the most important people in any organization. And even though often they don't get access to the executive bathroom or they don't get the stock options, they're the people that really count. And COVID has proven it in terms of the number of communications and the level of value that these people have. So one way of thinking about this is, the level of unknown in the industrial world was very much thought of like this. You reduced it, you did planning, you did designs, you spent a great deal of time looking at the problem, you then created the solution, and then you got more and more efficient with it, and change happened a little bit, but ultimately it didn't affect you. The reality is that we live in this massive spiral of change. For instance, we still don't know if the schools are going to be open the week after Thanksgiving in the US. We have no idea what the situation is going to be. So that sets the scene for Scrum, right? I've spent 10 minutes really setting the scene for where Scrum is and how important we believe Scrum and Agile thinking is to the future of work and to the future of our response to this complexity. Now, 19th of October, 1995, Ken Schwaber got onto an aeroplane and flew to Uppsala in Austin, Texas. And with him, he took a paper. That paper was about 100 and something pages long, and it described an approach to delivering software, to delivering object-oriented software, that was called Scrum. You could argue that was the birth of Scrum 25 years ago. And if you want to read that paper, you can. It's on the scrum.org website. It's kind of interesting. It has 5 phases. It has lots of things, artifacts. It has more roles defined. It's kind of interesting. It's quite complex. But that's 25 years ago. And it really was focused, interestingly, and this is still today, initially on something called the Stacy chart, which is on the left. And what it was really focused on is managing this complex type of project that software, particularly object-oriented software, was at that time. Now, that ultimately means that, if you use another model, the Cynefin model, that it's complex. you know,
Alexa,
that
pausa.
process emerges in
Alexa,
response.
pausa.
Sorry, somebody's talking to Alexa, but it just sounds like my house. When my children discovered Alexa, it changed everything. It means that they kept switching on the lights and the TV. It drove us mad. But anyway, so it means that, you know, that process emerges in response to the environment around us. That means empirical process control, as opposed to the traditional industrial mindset of defined process control, becomes the inevitable way of working, and that's really at the heart of Scrum. And everybody's seen the framework. There was an interesting question about the framework today on a call that I had. Is this picture gonna change with the new Scrum guide, because this has been around for a while? The short answer is not in the short term. However, maybe at some point we will change it. However, this is still true. This framework, which really was developed 25 years ago, has become sort of like the de facto standard for effectively delivering value in spite of the world around you, a complex world around you. So simple framework popped out, great, nice to see, and that's Scrum, and it has reached 25 years because of you. 90% of agile teams use Scrum as defined by Forrester. About 500,000 people have been trained on Scrum. A little bit more than that have been trained and or certified. 100 books with Scrum in the title. You know, the fact is that Scrum is everywhere, and the Scrum guide is free and available for everybody. It's translated into many languages, including Spanish, Portuguese, not German, well, German, but not currently. The new version hasn't got German yet. There was a mix-up, but you'll see that Scrum has become this sort of de facto standard for really describing how teams organize to respond to a complex environment. Words like Scrum Master, backlog, retrospective have become natural parlance in today's world, which is super exciting for me, and certainly super exciting if you're a Scrum professional. So let's talk a little bit about the 2020 update. So yesterday at 10 a.m. Boston East Coast time, so the same time zone as you, we kicked off a webinar for 3 hours that launched the new Scrum Guide. Now, the Scrum Guide isn't owned by Scrum.org or Scrum Inc. or Scrum Alliance or any of these organizations. It's owned by Ken and Jeff. It's delivered to the world through a Creative Commons license that gives free rein to the readers of Scrum to do what they, you know, to be able to use it. It can be found on Scrum Guide, scrumguides.org, or you can obviously get to it via the scrum.org website. Now, the changes around this, I'm going to go through in a little bit more detail in a second. The changes around this can be found, if you want to more detail and you want to read after today, you can go at Scrum Guide 2020 on our website. But ultimately, the real definition of the changes are these 7 things. You know, when Ken and Jeff worked on this for over a year, really, they started work pretty much when the 17 guide was launched. About 6 months afterwards, they started talking about some of the feedback they got for the 2017 guide and what kind of things that encouraged. They focused on these 7 things. Number 1, less prescriptive. You know, so one thing that's very important about Scrum that we sometimes forget is that Scrum is a framework. And the problem with frameworks is you have to instantiate them in your context, in your situation, in your organization. You have to add additional practices. You have to inspect and adapt those practices. You have to continuously look at the usage via the retrospective, but also the sprint review as well, to improve and change that how you implement it. What we found, you can imagine 25 years ago, Ken wrote this seminal piece that, you know, was hundreds of pages about Scrum. It was very complex, very prescriptive. It then evolved very quickly into something less prescriptive. In fact, so less prescriptive that there was multiple versions of it coming out. Then Ken created the first Scrum guide. Over the time, since a little bit over, I guess like 2000 and something, 2004 or 5, he created the first Scrum guide, literally on scrumguides.org. He started it, and then slowly people kept saying, well, what about this? What about this? And he obviously, and Jeff, bent to their whims and added more stuff. 3 questions in the daily Scrum. A retrospective always needs to find one item that's going to be improved in the next sprint. The idea of how planning's done, the concept of stories, the refinement, all of this crept in, and it grew and grew and grew and grew. And the last 2017 was 19 pages long. Now, that doesn't sound much, but unfortunately, the more it grows, the more prescription is in it, the harder it is to use in every context without having to change stuff, drop stuff, and the like. So what we've found over and over again is that the more prescriptive or the more stuff we have in Scrum, the less usable it is as it is. It requires more intelligent thought to change it, which ultimately reduces its value. So one thing that Jeff and Ken pressed on this one was to make it less prescriptive. The next thing is around one team focused on one product. And you might say, well, hang on a minute, Dave. There's only one team, the Scrum team. Hang on. In the 2017 release of the guide, the Scrum team actually was made up of 3 roles, and one of those roles was a team, the development team. So that meant, and the development team was responsible for delivering a valuable increment or potentially releasable increment in 2017 parlance. Now, what's interesting is, does that mean the Scrum Master and the product owner don't care about the increment? Well, no, the product owner does because of the value that they're defining, right? So what about the Scrum Master? What about that Scrum Master? Sorry, can somebody that's talking, can you go onto mute? It's a little challenging. Joel, can you mute that person? Thank you. I know you're living on Zoom calls. I know what it's like. So ultimately, was the Scrum Master not responsible for the increment? Well, some organizations took that to heart, and some Scrum Masters did, and said, no, I'm a servant leader. It's their job. It's whatever. And that ultimately resulted in actually a lack of focus. So now there was no more dev team. The Scrum team is responsible for delivering a valuable increment at least every 30 days. And that's awesome, right? Because it gives us clear focus. The introduction of a product goal. This is perhaps my most important addition, because I'm a product owner and I care very much about providing clear direction to the team in terms of why we're doing stuff. And that's really what the essence of a product goal is. It's a commitment on the product backlog by the team. We're committing to trying to deliver this goal. And this goal ultimately is described hopefully in a smart way. So it's succinct, it's measurable, it's agreed upon, it's not too big, not too complex. It's defined, it's defined by a time base. But the product goal will help set the scene for the whole product backlog and then all the subsequent sprints around it. There's been some structural changes with sprint goal, definition of done, and product goal. You'll notice I use the word commitment, which is a new structural element to the artifact. There's been some changes in wording around self-managed, self-organized, which I'm less religious about. Some of our trainers and sort of deep Scrum thinkers get very concerned about words, and obviously self-managed is a very different phrase from self-organized. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then planning changed a little bit, and then ultimately the specification, the simplicity of the language has been broadened to include a wider audience. which really means that the explicit support for software development has been removed to make it more applicable for more situations. Because what we've noticed with our community is that not the majority, but at least almost half of the people attending classes today are not directly software developers. Yes, software influences their life, obviously, but for instance, they might be working for British Petroleum and be actually working in a team who's responsible for the safety of the rigs. So their product backlog has a very clear goal to provide, blah, blah, safety, blah, blah, blah. And their product backlog is continuously being updated with challenges to that safety imperative that's described in the product goal. Now, they found the Scrum Guide a little bit like, well, does that really apply to me? It's, I'm a geoengineer or a real engineer, I'm mechanical or whatever. So we've removed that language and tried to simplify it for a wider audience. If you want to read this, it's on the Scrum Guide site. So at the heart, though, Scrum is still Scrum. In my opinion, the Scrum Guide has improved to really describe Scrum in its essence. And really, if I was going to say the two major themes, one is about one team focused on one product, and the other one is around less prescription, more broader applicability. And I think that when we look at those two things, and the Scrum team being accountable for this valuable, useful increment, the changes, the word role has been removed, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, and the addition of the why, coupled with the less prescription, I think the guide is significantly better. However, I'm not really the judge. I'm perhaps too close to it. Maybe you guys could be able to tell me that at some point in the future when you've had some chance to use it and apply it. So let's talk about some of those things. I just want to sort of double down a little bit on the one team focused on delivering value. In the 2007 guide, we had the Scrum team comprising of the product owner, the Scrum master, and the dev team. This guide, we don't have that. The reason why this is so powerful is the clarity that this allows us. Ultimately, everybody, the Scrum Master and the product owner, are accountable for delivering a valuable increment every sprint, which has to be less than 30 days, right? So that gives us the power to really provide that clarity. There's no, well, it's actually the dev team's responsibility. There's no pointing fingers. There's no, Scrum Masters that say, hey, not my fault. Because ultimately, the only reason why we're doing Scrum, the only reason why we do Agile isn't because we love it, though I love it. So maybe sometimes that's not true for me, but it's because it provides us with a mechanism to deliver value. And everything else is kind of moot. And the Scrum Master's responsibility, what they bring to that is they bring Scrum. They bring the tools and techniques of Scrum. They ensure that work flows. They ensure that work is transparent, which allows inspection and adaptation. So if they do not believe that that is contributing to the increment, and if their teams don't, then I think we're in trouble. They're not chief scribe, unfortunately, or fortunately. So the next thing is around this self-managed, self-organized. So a lot of people, I have to say, the first time I read the new guide, I didn't even pick up on this. A lot of people picked up on this much faster than me. And they said, Dave, this is huge change. I'm like, really? For me, self-managed and self-organized are really the same. The semantic difference, yeah, I don't really get. Because when I look in the literature, I find that both of them are used very similarly. Different people will define self-organized as all these things and self-managed being a subset. Other people will do the opposite, which is fine for me. I don't, this isn't mathematics or anything, right? However, the reason why the change came when I talked to Ken about this, he said, look, he said, what I wanted to really emphasize wasn't the way work's organized, but the way work's done. I want to emphasize the fact that all the management tasks that traditionally would be associated with delivering a done increment need to be owned by the Scrum team. So that means that priority, budgets maybe, allocation of work, all of that stuff could be part of that job. Now, depending on the context, that means that it could do lots of things, they could do less things, because context is everything. What it means to manage the work to deliver value to the customer in one organization might be very different to another organization. So context really defines what that means. However, that does not mean you will not need managers. Managers might be in the Scrum team, providing the value, facilitating the conversations, using their network and using their skills to help us deliver a valuable, usable, done increment every sprint. Or they might be outside the Scrum team, working with them to create an environment for success, taking impediments and removing them.
Very nice.
It doesn't matter. Managers could still exist. They might not as well. Teams may take over all those responsibilities, including hiring and firing and all of that. It doesn't matter. The focus of the Scrum Guide is very much on delivering value. And if whatever the management has to do that have to be owned by the Scrum team, because ultimately they are accountable for doing that, right? So for me, this wasn't a big change. However, for many, it was, because they spend a lot of time reading books about bureaucracy and things like that, which are far too hard for me. I don't really understand those books. Accountabilities versus roles. Now, some of the more eagle-eyed readers may have noticed that the term accountability roles has been replaced with accountabilities. That was actually for a really important reason. The association with job title and, hey, I'm a Scrum Master level 2, sometimes makes us forget the essence of the accountabilities required in Scrum. By all means, call people Scrum Masters, product owners, even developers. But the bottom line is that what we care about isn't the title, it's the accountabilities. So this gives us more flexibility around being to effectively saying, hey, don't worry about your job title. If you're called a Scrum Master and that's your job title, that's a unique thing for your situation and your organization. You'll still need to do that, but these are how the Scrum Guide talks about those accountabilities. And the 3 accountabilities are super important. So you can still be called a product owner, you can still be called a Scrum Master, that's not a problem. And they can be inspired by the Scrum Guide. However, there's going to be a lot of other stuff that comes with it. And let's not muddy the two with a roles term, which could confuse that. One of the other things that changed, the Scrum Master ultimately cares about making Scrum work for that Scrum team, supporting both the team, the developers on that team to deliver, to do the work, the product owner to really build that backlog and ensure value is being delivered, and then the organization to really create the environment for Scrum to succeed. Part of their responsibility is around transparency. If I was going to give a Scrum Master one sort of title, it's Chief Transparency Officer, really. They care very deeply about ensuring that the good and the bad rises to the surface for people to make decisions on it. Ultimately, we care deeply about inspection and adaptation through transparency. That's how empiricism works, right? Now, to do that effectively, you need to for the three artifacts of Scrum, the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the increment, you need to have some things. You need to have what we call commitments. We're committing to making this transparent with a sprint goal, for instance, at the sprint backlog. For the increment, the definition of done provides the transparency around what it means to be done, which is super valuable if you're trying to actually deliver stuff, right? And now we've added a new commitment called the product goal. That product goal ultimately provides the transparency to the team of why we're here. Now, guess what? All of those things can change as we learn more. They're firm at that moment, precise, defined. However, they change often, and the outcome of that change will depend. Sometimes in the case of the product goal or the sprint goal, we may discover that our endeavor, the work that we're doing, the why, is no longer relevant. We were thought that this business opportunity or this opportunity was really clear. When we actually did some work and delivered some value, we realized quite quickly that this opportunity was not an opportunity, and we need to quickly step back from it. Likely though that what we do is refine those goals in response to that. Now, the great thing that Scrum does is it has a sprint review and a sprint planning session, but the sprint review gives us the ability to get stakeholders in to review those things and say, hey, this is why we did this. This is what we found, right? And that gives us the ability to then feed into the process, which then allows us to improve all those things and get better. You know, the Scrum ultimately is always about getting better. And this clarity of commitment is fantastic. Now, I know some of you are like, well, hang on a minute, sprint goal and definition are done, we're already there. Yeah, they were, but they were never really, they were mandatory, but they were never really real in the guide. They were kind of spread out, their definitions were in different places. By having this concept of a commitment, I really like it because it clearly says that the relationship with the artifact and the mission or purpose of this in the context of that artifact, which is great. And it's all about transparency. One of those particular commitments is something I really care about. And in fact, I care so much about it. If you listen to the launch webinar, JJ, the CEO of Scrum Inc., and I spend 45 minutes with Patricia Kong talking about commitments and talking about this particular one. This took the lion's share because I care deeply about the goal. So when I used to be allowed to leave this house and travel the world, I have the best job in the world, ladies and gentlemen. I spend my life traveling the world, talking about Scrum, seeing people use Scrum, helping people maybe understand something slightly different about it. And so I get that opportunity. So I go in, whenever I do a talk like this in person, I normally persuade the PST like a Joel to let me go and see some of his clients. And little do they know, what I'm doing actually is learning. Yes, I might share some stuff, but ultimately I'm listening to them. Now, when I visited lots of clients, I see fabulous Scrum boards. So you make the work visible, right? You see the progress, and maybe you've taken advantage of Kanban and it's got WIP limits and time aging charts. Maybe you're even using cumulative flow, which is really cool. That's great. And the team's really excited about it. But I then say, well, where is the persona, the customer, the goal? And that tends to be a little bit more hidden. In fact, what's really worrying is that often what we find is that people don't know what the goal is. They don't know why. They might know the sprint goal. Mute. Okay. Sorry, I was just muting everybody so because there's a little background noise. My wife would love to have that button, by the way, on me in life. I don't think she hasn't found it yet. Anyway, so I used to ask the teams, why are you doing this? Sometimes they'd tell me about the sprint goal, but often those goals were like a little bit out of sync. They weren't transparent. They weren't being communicated. So the great thing about a product goal is that it clearly communicates the why. And Scrum insists, as much as Scrum can insist upon anything, that that goal is clearly communicated and transparent so we can inspect and adapt it. It's something we strive for. And because it's a goal, it's measurable. Because it's a goal, it's probably smart, right? So it has all those characteristics. There's only one at a time, which means we have to make choices. God, choices are horrible, right? We have to decide what we're going to focus this work on. Now, that might mean that it's a long-term goal. You may decide to break things down into much shorter-term goals, maybe only adequate for 3 or 4 sprints or 2 sprints. The Scrum Guide doesn't actually tell you how big or small the goal needs to be. It just tells you need one. And I believe that this is a great opportunity to do experimentation on how you work and what you're trying to strive for. It's also a great opportunity. The product owner owns the product goal like they own the product backlog. The product owner and the team have a great opportunity then to talk with stakeholders and ultimately deal with the conflicting goals and the multiple goals that maybe the business or maybe the investors really think you should be working on. And that's the art of being a good product owner, to resolve all of those different perspectives, to balance all of them and have a goal that drives the team that is clear. It also means that every sprint review, we have something tangible to discuss. The work against, the context for that work, not just the sprint goal, but the success of how we're moving against that product goal. A question that I always ask in every sprint review is, after we've looked at the work, I'm like, okay, how can we now get towards our product goal faster? What's left to do? Because ultimately that then drives the planning exercise and allows us to rapidly deliver value. Product goals hopefully allow us not to do everything. So that initial list of PBIs that were, this is how I think we're going to do it. Maybe we didn't deliver half of them, but we still attained our product goal. That's a fantastic situation, because the best Scrum teams, I'm not going to use the word lazy, but they are, their economy of motion is intelligent. You know, they don't necessarily do everything. They do the right things to deliver the value as defined by the product goal. Hello. The next thing isn't particularly big, but I guess it speaks of this why thing that came out of this guide, or was put in, sorry, to this guide. English language is very confusing sometimes. In 2017, sprint planning had 2 topics: what can be done and how will we do it. Now we've added an additional topic, which is about value, defining the value, crafting the sprint goal in the context of the product goal. And then we do the next 2 things. So really now it's very clear that the team has a responsibility to uncover what they're trying to achieve, why they're trying to achieve, the context, the true north, as it were. So I'm pretty excited about the Scrum Guide. I don't know about you. You know, we've now got a clearer connection to value. We've now focused the team. We've now clearly described some of those key transparency elements in that definition. We've now emphasized the power that the team has to manage itself and its work. The last thing isn't as interesting as any of those things, but it's necessary to make Scrum more applicable and usable. The previous versions of the Scrum Guide, dating all the way back to that original Uppsala paper, had a very clear connection to software development. Not a surprise, right? That was the context. They were the projects that Ken was working on. whether it's FBI Sentinel, whether it's Patient Keeper, or any of the other projects that he worked on. Ultimately, we've had to change that because Scrum is being used in so many locations. I have a monthly call with two basically agile leaders, for want of a better title, change agents, Scrum Masters, in two of the largest biotech companies in the world. These companies are doing cutting edge research. There's some software, but it isn't that. The head of R&D for one of the largest car and coolest car companies in the world is using Scrum to build the next generation of cars. You know, the fact that SpaceX uses Scrum, Tesla uses Scrum, all of those people are using Scrum. And they're like, yeah, we read the Scrum guide, it didn't feel right. So we've tried throughout this release to update the Scrum guide to make it more universally acceptable. Development terms have been replaced. Release has been replaced with reusable. You know, but that applies to a marketing program or something. You don't release a marketing program, you make it available to use. Potentially shippable has been replaced with reliable and useful. Things like that have changed everywhere. So hopefully that makes Scrum more usable for you. Now, that's cool. New Scrum guide. Hopefully it's going to be more usable for you. But remember, when we're debating the nuances of the language in the guide, and believe me, ladies and gentlemen, over the last year, as Joel can attest to, there's been a lot of debate about the language in the guide. That isn't the real reason. Scrum is still Scrum. Empirical process, self-managed, empowered teams, continuous improvement. That's the fundamentals of Scrum. That still is the fundamentals of Scrum. We haven't changed that. Scrum is still Scrum. Now, to be successful with Scrum, you kind of have to step up your game around those three things. You need to add professionalism. Now, obviously, we talk about professional Scrum, and Joel talks about professional Scrum all the time, and our trainers talk about professional Scrum. Really, if I was going to describe the essence of professional Scrum, what I would focus on is values and behavior. The fact is, to use Scrum successfully, you have to step up how you engage with other human beings. You know, obviously, people like Gunther Rehm talk about, you know, humanizing the workplace. That's cool, but I actually think about being a good person. Because you have to create an environment that both allows focus, that creates a feeling of trust, which allows transparency. You need to create an environment where respect is a natural behavior. And if you're interested in more details about that, we did a study with McKinsey about the agile worker, as it were, and we found the key behavioral characteristics. And there's a really nice kind of like hiring guide. Not that you need to be brainwashed and only hire the people that, but it's a kind of really good set of reminders for how you interview people to look for these behaviors. The other thing is we need to be disciplined and focused. To do Scrum effectively, you need to be disciplined. You need to go to the daily and be willing to talk about the challenges that you see. You need to be disciplined in completing the definition of done, writing success criteria of PBIs, you know, focused on making the board transparent by feeding it. All of those things require discipline. Discipline is crucial to success. Now, because there's not a prescriptive process, sometimes that means that you have to be disciplined, not the process. The goal stuff and additions to the Scrum Guide in 2020 have helped us, reminded us that it's all about delivering value to customers. One thing that was, I think, missing from previous Scrum Guides was this reminder. We care very deeply about this in professional Scrum because ultimately, you know, things like professional Scrum with UX and the like has taught us, and our product owner curriculum has taught us the importance of delivering value. And that means ultimately delivering outcomes that change the state of your customer's behavior or the value that they get from the product. The last element is something that any good professionalism is about, right? The way that Scrum scales isn't through me, really, it's through you, helping others, spending time mentoring and coaching, running events like this, which thank you for inviting me to. Helping others is crucial to being a good professional and ensuring that Scrum flourishes. I was recently at Toyota. Actually, it wasn't that recent now, was it? It was last year. But so last year I was at Toyota and I was talking to the head of the digital side of Toyota. And he's from Japan, and his best friend is the grandson of the guy that created Toyota. So he's very steeped in the culture of Toyota. And he told me that the most important thing about being a Toyota manager isn't what you do for your team. That is important. It's a given, right? It's what you do for other teams. Your job is to go and spread the values of Toyota to other teams and to the world around you to make them better, because hopefully they'll buy more Toyota products, but ultimately, or if they're inside the organization, they'll deliver more value. So I thought that was really, really interesting. So I wanted to share with you today what Scrum Guide 2020 has done. I think it's gone back to its roots. It's a framework. I think we've been reminded of that. And I think Jeff and Ken did a fantastic job reminding us of that. It's much simpler than it was. It's now only 13 pages. It's focused on one team delivering value as defined by a goal, working incrementally. It's about that team being empowered to manage the work necessary to do that. And it's about that team getting better every sprint in pursuit of the value that their customers need to change the world. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, and this is the worst thing about Scrum for me, not being the smartest guy in the room, don't leave your brain at home. You have to use Scrum in a mindful and thoughtful way. If you do that, you can change the world. And that's what's super exciting about Scrum. And I think the 2020 release of the guide has really, hopefully, opened up the conversations about that, because that's ultimately what Scrum's about every day. So that's what I wanted to talk about. Hopefully this was valuable. I don't know. There's a few people online and you're probably dealing with children and getting your dinner and you've just been listening to me in the background, or maybe I'm being used to put your children to sleep. I understand that's a very valuable characteristic of my voice. Fair enough. Hopefully this has been valuable. Joelle,